Hello and welcome to the latest in the series of Green Book podcasts. Back in 2013, four experienced figures in the Liberal Democrats published the Green Book, which looked to integrate the environment as a constant theme running through all Lib Dem policy areas. 10 years later, the four reconstituted the Green Book group, with one or two new additions, to explore modern-day policy options for the Liberal Democrats using the medium of podcasts. You can listen to all the previous podcasts by visiting green-book.org.uk or by going to the Lib Dem Podcast platform. All the Green Book podcasts to date have focused on one policy area. But today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to look at what liberalism can offer by way of hope and optimism. Heavens, do we need a bit of optimism to inject into the political landscape at the moment? I'm Chris Bowers and I'm figures from today's liberal landscape. Layla Moran is one of the most high-profile members of the current Lib Dem parliamentary party. She stood for the leadership in 2020. In the last parliament, she gained massive respect for her nuanced but very sensitive comments on the war in Gaza following the 7th of October attacks, and she's now chair of the House of Commons Health and Social Care Select Committee. Once asked to describe liberalism in one word, she replied, kind. Baroness Featherstone of Highgate, better known as Lynne Featherstone, was the Lib Dem MP for Hornsey and Wood Green from 2005 to 2015. And in the Tory Lib Dem coalition, she was first a Home Office Minister and then Minister for International Development. Perhaps her greatest claim to fame is in being the architect of the same-sex marriage bill that allowed people of the same gender to marry, and it put those marriages on the same footing as traditional marriages. In the 2009 MP's expenses scandal, the Daily Telegraph, which broke the expenses scandal story, listed Lynne as one of its saints. Timothy Garton is a professor of European studies at Oxford University and is widely known as a historian, author and commentator of European history in general, but in particular of the nearly 80 years since the Second World War. Anyone interested in recent history should read his memoir, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, as it documents the final years of the Cold War, that sort of strangely optimistic interregnum in the 90s, and the rise of Vladimir Putin. Timothy's wife, Danuta, is Polish, and his knowledge of Poland is even better than his already impressive knowledge of most other European countries. He's never been a member of any political party, but describes himself as a lifelong liberal with a small L. So that's our panel. Let me give you the running order. In a minute, I'm going to ask all three to speak for about 3 minutes on one aspect of liberalism that they think gives reason to believe that something hopeful might emerge from the British political landscape. Once they've all done that, I'm going to ask them to comment on each other's offerings, asking any questions if necessary, and picking up on themes we might develop. And then the final part of the discussion will be on what kind of policies we might look to move towards so that we can see some hope and optimism in a future Liberal Democrat platform in British politics. We're going to start with Layla Moran. She has chosen to speak on the tenet that liberalism espouses that the answers to the world's most difficult questions come from listening to and working with others. Take it away, Layla.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And I think it's more important than ever in the rise of sort of nationalism and populism that we are having, how to improve liberalism discussions. I genuinely think they are the antidote. And to that end, when asked, to distill this down and on reflection of the things that I've been trying to grapple with in, being the NHS and social care now in my role as chair, or before that, foreign affairs spokesperson, and thinking about, liberalism on the geopolitical stage, but also as a local MP who gets lots of emails about bins and potholes and everything else. How do these things all link together? And fundamentally, it is a belief that liberals have, and it's more than just a cursory belief. It drives the way we do politics. That liberals know we don't individually have the answer, but that the way we achieve the best answers is to listen to the people who are most affected by the laws that we are trying to push down. So, for example, at local government, and this is why liberals are people who believe in localism. Localism means that it's that we're sort of steeped in our community, that we constantly think about how the community works together. Very often, we will play a consensus role. We love being councillors. We love leading local government, but our local government colleagues who succeed are the ones who successfully manage to bring people around an idea, and drive them forward with great success. For example, house building can often be something that's quite a thorny issue in parts of the country. And yet the Liberal Democrat councils that manage to do this, and many do, bring people around a central idea, often deliver more housing, better housing, more social housing, and people aren't as upset about it. And so that approach is really, really key. When it comes to health and social care, I mean, it speaks for itself. And there's a reason why I was so keen to take up this role, especially at a time when social care is on its knees. But by and large, in the rest of the country, these thorny issues, these difficult issues, you'll find the Liberal Democrats don't shy away from having those conversations. That's why Lynne is such a hero in my eyes. We actually have the propensity to take a difficult issue, grapple with it, and then bring consensus to it. We've got the assisted dying vote today. Liam MacArthur did that very successfully in Scotland and led that debate. In the past, we have too. So that is our approach. And then on the geopolitical stage, well, I mean, I would very much hope it speaks for itself. It was Liberals that set up the international rules-based order. It was Liberals who said, actually, if the world is going to become more interconnected, more complex, then the only way that you achieve a positive future for everybody is by setting up the structures, whether it be the UN, the ITC, whatever it is, that allows people to speak with each other, understand each other's point of view, and from that perspective, move forward. That, to me, is what liberalism is about.
Thank you very much, Layla. Let's move on to Lynne Featherstone, who's going to speak on the optimistic aspect that Liberals believe the vast majority of people are good. All yours, Lynne.
Thank you. And I appreciate Layla thinking I actually thought about anything before I did same-sex marriage. I just thought that it needed doing. So my message for hope and optimism is that the vast majority of people are good. And I'll tell you how I know that in a minute. The challenge we have is that the prevailing winds of media and social media and politics is nothing but undermining, hateful and detrimental, and sadly very, very powerful, because for some reason negatives work better than positives. We haven't even recovered yet from Brexit and the way it was conducted, because it harmed us as a nation. Truth was a victim, and people felt empowered not only to lie, but to hate the other side. Political protagonists peddled dislike, disdain, denigration of other, and fear. And we created an unhappy and angry nation. And we are bombarded with hate because hate sells, hate works, hate garners votes, it strikes emotion in us, hatred of others, foreigners, immigrants, scroungers, Muslims, Jews, the rich, the lazy, the lucky, we hate them all. Years of the drip, drip poison of enemies of the people and negative type political campaigning has taken its toll. Politicians have become reductionist in order to find simplistic messages that focus groups tell us will win. And to win, well, lies don't matter. Truth is fake news. Facts, who cares? Experts with real knowledge disparaged. And to win, the common good comes way, way behind party good. And public discourse is driven by heat, not light, with the media feeding a frenzy of the negative and the nasty, amplified by the Twitter sphere, but led by politicians. However, having depressed us all thoroughly, there really is a core of goodness in our nation. And the vast, vast majority of people are good. And I'll tell you how I know and how actually you all know, because when it's a rainy, dark, horrible Monday night and you have to go out canvassing and you really don't feel like it, after around 5 doors, I begin to vaguely enjoy it. But by the time I get home, my faith in human nature has actually been restored, because behind the vast majority of doors are these good people who just want to earn a living, look after their families, care about the planet, and make their way home. We just need to make that vast majority vote for us.
Thank you very much indeed, Lynne. And now to Timothy Garton-Ash, who's opted to address the fact that liberalism is distinguished by its capacity for self-criticism. Timothy, the floor is yours.
It's great to be with you all. And as a good liberal, I immediately want to take up what both Layla and Lynne have said, and in part at least disagree with it. But let me give you my pitch first. I think one of the greatest strengths of liberalism over centuries has been its capacity for self-criticism. That really distinguishes liberals. to learn from our mistakes and then to address them. And I think we have to acknowledge that the reason that so many people, not just in this country, but across the liberal democratic world, have gone to anti-liberal, nationalist, populist parties is because the things they associate with liberalism haven't worked for them. Francis Fukuyama, in talking about why Trump won again, summed this up very, very pithily. He said the problem has been on the one side, quote unquote, neoliberalism, and on the other side, quote unquote, woke liberalism. Now, I don't like the term woke, but let's take it in those terms. So neoliberalism in the sense that we have massive economic inequalities. A few people have got very much richer, Elon Musk and so on, and a lot of people in our societies have not. That was one of the reasons behind the Brexit vote. That's one of the reasons behind support for the Reform Party. Now, quote unquote, woke liberalism, I want to be very clear. I think it's a very good thing that we are paying much more attention to all different sorts of minority. But what white working class, and sometimes white working class men in particular, think is you're paying attention to everyone else, but not to us. We need to pay attention to them as well as to everyone else. So those are two just very quick examples of where this great liberal strength of self-criticism can generate new policies which bring the voters back and bring liberalism back in force. In short, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So I think the pessimism of the intellect, the understanding how deep the problems are, the understanding what liberals or what has been associated with liberal has gone wrong, is actually a precondition for getting that optimism that we all need.
Okay, so are you disagreeing with what Lynne was saying about people being fundamentally optimistic, Timothy?
Yes. Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry
but I would push back and say that that is because of everything that has happened, because of the way things have gone, and because liberals are not in government. I think it would have been quite different if we were.
Well, I mean, and if liberalism had been true to their liberalism, but I mean, I'm talking more broadly about liberal democracies. But can I just pick up Lynne's point? Because I actually would put it slightly differently. What I think a sort of core premise of liberalism is that people can be good, can be very good, can be incredibly good, but they can also be very bad. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years in Ukraine. Tell me about people behaving badly. This is so we can be higher than the angels, but also lower than the worst devils. That's the lesson of Europe's 20th century.
I think that's human. I don't think that's just liberalism. I think
but you were speaking about, sorry, Lynne, you were speaking about the vast majority of people are good, yes, saying yes, they can be very good and bad. So here's the point, though. Here's the important point. What distinguishes liberalism historically is its concern, therefore, to limit all forms of power. That's one of the absolutely distinctive features of liberalism. The problem is liberalism has been very good at limiting public power. And actually, I think in Britain, we're still doing a relatively good job of that. You know, the checks and balances are working much better than in many other places. Where we're still falling down is limiting private power, right?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that.
Well, I'm not even asking you to disagree. I think it's a way to take the conversation forward, which is, you know, if you look at the terrible role that someone like Elon Musk has played, but also the role money has played in our politics, you know, that I think is a real challenge for us as liberals.
But that's what we have to work with, because I don't think there's anywhere where that doesn't play a part, where the rich or the powerful have sway over everyone else. I mean, it's about how you can get the vast majority of people to live in a democratic society where their will has something to do with the way things go.
Completely. But if I may, I mean, Martin Wolf in his book on democratic capitalism has a very good point, which is the great achievement of liberal democracy was to separate wealth and power, right? So for most of human history, wealth and power were like this. liberal democracy managed to separate them. And the problem is, in a phenomenon like Elon Musk, or the outsized role money plays in American, but also British politics, the fact that it is, let's be frank, to put it crudely, if we look at Lord Cruddas, you can almost buy a seat in one house of the British Parliament. And that's a truly shocking fact. And I don't want to be sued for libel, so I'm putting this cautiously, but that is a kind of shocking fact. So I think that's something we have to work on.
Okay, but on the basis that people vote in elections, what the point that Layla was making about liberals don't always have the answers. For me, when someone admits I don't have all the answers, that is a sign of strength. And yet at the moment, there seems to be a zeitgeist of, I want someone to stir things up. Why are people voting for strong men? Could be a strong woman, but I mean the word strong man as one. Do you want to pick on Layla?
Yeah, I think it's this concept of scarcity, isn't it, and uncertainty. When people feel under pressure, when people feel that the basics of the day-to-day just aren't working for them, they're under a lot of stress. We see the proliferation of mental health issues, post-pandemic, post-financial crash. I mean, frankly, I think it kind of began with the financial crash, at least in my generation, the sort of 40-year-olds and under.
Yep.
There's a sort of jealousy, frankly, between our generation and our parents, who very often were sort of helped into, many were sort of first to go to university, huge steps up in social mobility. They then went into a profession or a job, and the world seemed to sort of carry them through, and the housing market helped them to accrue wealth that they didn't earn. And actually, it's this incredible life that they've had. And bluntly, even though I'm 3 years older than my sister, I graduated in 2000. It meant that I finished my university in 2003. I've done pretty well. Those 3 years where the financial crash actively affected my sister getting her first job, and I've seen it since in the two that are younger, but it's a trend. They feel that they've been kind of given a completely different social contract to others. And it's not just them, that this also has, and it's not just an age thing, but I think the generational gap is important. It's also a socioeconomic background thing. Those who were more vulnerable were also affected, even if they were older. And so what has emerged is a feeling, first of all, of that broken social contract, but also a general sense of uncertainty and feeling like you don't have power over your life. So they want, and we've seen this before, when the prefrontal cortex is engaged, people tend to vote liberal. They tend to have the space to be able to have those rational, thoughts. Liberals are famed, I think, for, and this is maybe coming to both of these, the points that Lynne and Timothy were making. We can hold multiple views at the same time and find a way through. And this is my point. Working together means that you are actively engaging in more than one view. But when you're just getting by, when you're working several jobs, when you don't see much of a future, it's really, really hard to ask people to do that. So, that's my prognosis. The difficulty then comes, what do you do about it? And, actually giving people some of that space to be able to help them, make them feel that they are listened to, make them feel that they've got some of that control. The populist and nationalist narratives are all about, you know what, your life's difficult. It's someone else's fault. The someone else is, all of those people who we see hate directed towards, the elite, the Jews, whatever it is. And so that's a very easy thing to say. But then they say, well, just trust me, and I'm going to make it all better. Everyone knows in their hearts of hearts that that's not possible, but that wanting to shake the systems, because it's been decades now of people being told, we will fix this for you, and then they don't, and people not being honest about how difficult and how long that's going to take.
I think that's partly because politics has become about messaging without any actual change going on where it's actually needed in the country.
I think that's fair.
But going to Timothy's point, I think people have been neglected. I think you saw it in the Trump election, and I think you saw it in Brexit. I think you're absolutely right about that, because I'm a London elite, and I thought I was right about Brexit. I mean, it economically clearly was, but there was a kind of condescension and I know better than you attitude amongst the people who were against Brexit, who didn't really understand the living situation of people in areas that were neglected, and so it was able to be sold as a way to, it wasn't really about hating the EU. It was really about no one is listening to me. So I think on that count, Layla is absolutely right. It's about listening intently and making it possible. I mean, you're never going to make everything all right for everyone, but the imbalances have been far too huge in this country.
I couldn't agree more. Listening respectfully and trying to understand where people are coming from. And honestly, the liberal media failed in that too. Liberal academia, to some extent, failed in that. I think that's one of the great lessons of the Brexit vote and populism. But just to come back to Layla's point about 2008, which in my book, metaphorically and literally, because in Homelands, my book, A Personal History of Europe, 2008 is the turning point. The global financial crisis, its consequences, years of austerity, the Eurozone crisis. And by the way, the same year, Vladimir Putin has a go at Georgia, which is the beginning of his aggression in Eastern Europe. But what I want to emphasize is that there's a quite sort of specific political economy to the problem. It's not just about feelings. I mean, 2008, privatized profit, socialized loss. We picked up the tab for the irresponsibility of the financial services. And just today, I'm just reading in the FT before coming on this call, George Osborne, the Chancellor of Austerity, who imposes austerity on millions of ordinary people, excessive austerity, counterproductive austerity, in my view, is now in 1 year sharing with just 3 other partners £70 million profits from a financial services company. I mean, heavens above, there is something wrong here.
Yes, it's an obscenity. It is an obscenity, the divide.
It's an obscenity, and one can understand. And then, as Layla rightly says, the populists say it's all somebody else's fault. So it's all the bloody foreigners, quote unquote. And we have all the answers and all of that. But I mean, I think one has to go back to the sources of the feeling, which are both economic and cultural. So the economic ones, I mean, I think we actually have to be more redistributive. We have to tax the rich more. We have to tax the big tech platforms who pay almost no tax in this country. And then address the cultural causes too.
And I genuinely think that we have, I mean, just thinking about our party at the moment, but liberal parties more generally, perhaps, I'm not sure. While we have sort of the skeletons of, yes, we need to be more, I mean, every liberal will tell you, of course, we are more redistributive. Of course, we tax, the rich and the powerful, and we don't, but actually, I'm not convinced that we have a completely coherent economic policy that we are effectively communicating right now. We've been incredibly reactive in recent, through the last election, through recent months. And a good example is, the small farms tax. I mean, there are genuinely questions to be asked about whether this is going to be good, bad for them, what's the threshold, all the rest of it. But actually, this was potentially a moment where there could have been a wider conversation about inheritance tax. I mean, and we're refusing to have it because it's just too emotive. People don't want to talk about it.
But it's also because we're second to the Conservatives, or most of the seats we won were Conservative, and my big fear is that we're going to become leaders that way. Because
so bluntly, yes, and and those are all important considerations, and all of that I understand, and messaging and getting in the media and how do you present and all the rest of it. My worry is not necessarily that, is that what is that economic underpinning that's helping us to make all of those decisions? And I would posit that really hasn't had a proper conversation in the party for a long time. not since certainly, we lost all those MPs in 2015. I don't feel that we had that. Vince would often have the discussion, but very often sort of on his own.
Okay.
And which
could I ask you both? Sorry.
Go ahead, Timothy.
Well, no, but my point is, if we're going to do some of this, we've got to. Jo started it. So do you remember during that 2019 election, she started talking about the well-being economy. She's since gone on to talk about donut economies and things like that. But it was quite fleeting, and it came kind of out of nowhere. And actually, there hasn't been that broader conversation about what is the new liberal economic policy for now. Not like in general terms, in specific terms, what does that look like?
Could I ask you both, as active Lib Dems, whether you're having this conversation in the context of the Liberal International? Because Layla, one of the problems is that when you're going after the super rich, right, or the big transnational monopoly companies, no single nation state is powerful enough to do it, because they immediately say, oh, we'll just go somewhere else. We'll go after Liechtenstein, or we'll pay our taxes in Ireland, or whatever. So it actually needs liberal internationalism. It needs a working together of multiple liberal democracies to go after them. And it really is a relatively small number of individuals and companies, isn't it, who have such a disproportionate amount of the wealth.
Well, you'll know that we engage in Liberal International, but my point is, if we don't know what we want, how can we engage effectively on it? And Britain has a specific role to play, which is, financial services is an enormous part of our economy, and we are incredibly powerful across the world still, notwithstanding Brexit and people moving elsewhere and so on. We still have that strength. So, we have a platform as a nation on which we could lead, not just work with others, but lead on some of this. And I'm not at all convinced that as a Liberal Party, we have fully understood and grappled with that yet.
Can I throw a question to you, Timothy, about, you've done a great job of moving us from the analysis of what's gone wrong to what can we do? Because we need to focus, I think, for the rest of this discussion on what can possibly come out of this for the future. One of the few good news stories in recent years on the political landscape of Europe was the Polish election, when Donald Tusk got this coalition together, really mobilized the young adult vote. Are there lessons to be taken from that? And has it actually worked with Tusk's coalition in government? Briefly, if you could.
So I think the two best pieces of political news in Europe in the last year have been the British election, which is, after all, good news, and the Polish election. But the Polish election is even more remarkable because, we despite the strains that Brexit put on our democracy, still had a well-functioning democracy. We had a free and fair election. Now, Poland was already halfway to Viktor Orban's Hungary, right? It wasn't a level playing field. It was an unfair election. And yes, they won it. And that's what's so remarkable. Why? To Layla's point, they had a very clear program. They had good leadership who spoke in a way that, quote unquote, ordinary people could understand. And then they mobilized, including, by the way, massively on social media, largest turnout in Polish history. More women voted than men. More young people voted than old. Unheard of anywhere else. Yeah, we all know that. It's the old who vote, not the young. And so there, I think, is one of the lessons. Good organization, clear, straightforward messaging, and then that mobilization, all voters, women, young voters, and that's how you win.
What was their key message? Forgive me, I don't know.
Well, the key message was, do you want 4 more years of this horrendous, corrupt, illiberal, nationalist government, which, by the way, is discrediting us also in Europe? So it's interesting that also Europe played a role in that message.
Democrats couldn't get to work against Trump.
Say again?
That's the message. The Democrats couldn't get to work against Trump.
Yeah.
So it obviously worked in Poland, but I take it we're back to the sort of negative versus positive.
But they were in power. I mean,
yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah.
And
It's
also,
easier to be the ones not in power.
Yeah, and also, by the way, sorry, go on.
Well, just to say, I mean, in elections, there's sort of the big things that swing the dials, and then there's the small things that sort of help people to at the margins. I mean, if you look at what's happened as a general trend in liberal democracies so far, the incumbents have not had it easy. You know, incumbents everywhere, and it's primarily to do with the cost of living crisis in the economy, have really struggled. That's the big weight. And then where there were abilities to be able to eke that over the line. So, I mean, I would take from those stories, actually, that's the bigger story. And I'd be curious to, as ever, you know, when you're comparing one country to the other, we can't say, well, it worked here and it didn't work here, and therefore, actually, there's probably a lot of nuance in that. I am very interested, however, in how they turned up young people's turnout and how they got more women to vote. How did they do that? Some of that will just be simple mechanics. Some of that will be how they decided to engage with them in tone as well as in practicality. So, you know, some of this from Poland. And equally, whilst the Democrats clearly didn't win, I would also, you know, America's like just the level of division in America, I'm grateful that we just don't have the same level of discourse. I mean, I've got cousins who are American, and they tell me, and they're in New York, and then they feel it constantly. They've gone right to the extremes, and I'm desperately concerned about where America's going, because that will filter into our politics, let's be honest. But again, we've just got to be careful about sort of broad brush comparators like that.
Completely, but there is one specific lesson. They were incredibly good at using social media. And that's how they reach young voters.
But again,
and they weren't afraid, Layla. They weren't afraid of going not just on Facebook but on Instagram and on TikTok.
Yeah,
Ed is now on TikTok. I mean,
the how matters. So that's like saying back in the day they were very good at using paper, but actually what they said, how they said it, that's what I'm interested in. Everyone is on, or most of the social media platforms, and TikTok is relatively new. But we've always, you know, those are just the message, the way you deliver the messages. How did they do it? To what audience? Those are the things that I'm interested in.
Sure, and I can tell you in some detail how they did it, which was very carefully segmented specific messages for specific groups, and I can connect you with someone who actually helped them with it. But the broader point is, you know, in Romania, a wild card and pretty wild nationalist has just come first in the first round of the presidential elections. And one of the key reasons is he was massive on TikTok with ridiculous images of him riding white horses and doing judo. And across the continent, you see AfD in Germany too, huge on TikTok. Now, we tend to have a liberal conversation about regulating the platforms, which is a really important point. But while they're still there, we have to be on there. And, you know,
absolutely, but it's quite difficult. I'm one of the few in their lordship's house who is on these mediums, particularly I still call it Twitter. And we have
Blue Sky.
I'm on Blue Sky too, but I have 3 followers on Blue Sky and 25,000 on Twitter, so it's challenging. But yeah, we have to be on all the means. Very hard to get people to do it. Sometimes they're not natural. Young people come up doing it as if it's like breathing. But I was making inquiries because I saw Ed on TikTok dancing, dad dancing. It was totally embarrassing, obviously. So I made inquiries about this new strategy and was informed that he had 2 million views and 200,000 likes from young people. So, I mean, you know, whatever I might think, he's absolutely following the right strategy.
Yeah. Put it out there. I think we should realize that we don't know how to do it on TikTok, so we need other people to.
But it's interesting. We're talking about social media in a very positive context, and yet most of the
damaging. Yeah.
Most of the time, actually, it's a lot easier. Someone said to me this week, it's so much easier to get a lie believed than the truth believed on social media, and surely that is changing the whole ground rules of politics. How do we use social media for good? Or counter the malign effects where people can put, you know, they can diss the best ideas.
That's because hate sells. That's what I opened with. And it's how do you counter that? No one, I remember knocking on the door and the person wasn't that interested, to be frank. And I said, well, if we go, then the liberal voice will be missing from British politics. And she said, I don't give a about the liberal voice, because actually, in terms of critical thinking or the way people are educated, that doesn't seem to matter anymore. The good and the bad does. It's what can I get out of this? And it's a market that's transactional. It's probably why Trump's done so well. So in terms of policy, I would advocate that there's a fantastic argument for not being right or left, but for being well balanced and centrist and understanding arguments and, being able to hold two views. But I don't think that will sell in the British public. So how do you turn that into more?
And campaigning is emotional, right? The emotional side of the brain is very, very good at overriding the logical. Even when people think they're being logical, almost, and I noticed this in seats like Oxford, West and Abingdon, the ones in lofty North Oxford think they're ever so logical, Timothy, about how they engage with policy and politics and all the rest of it. And, elsewhere, they're sort of a bit more laissez-faire about that. Actually, it's quite interesting how when you get the messages right, and ultimately in the elections, the way that they engage with the politics is very, very similar. So we've just got to bear in mind, EQ matters. EQ matters as much as IQ. I think liberals have always tended to put IQ at a premium and forget a little bit occasionally about EQ. And when you get, the magic is when you get both together. And that's a combination of, having good communicators who can, I'm struck, Timothy, you saying, the leadership, their job was to speak in a way that people understood and felt relatable. That's exactly right. But we shouldn't lose sight. I mean, that logical part of being a liberal is so important. We aren't just here to offer. I mean, if I wanted to be just, I sometimes wish I had the freedom to be in the Reform Party and just be totally reactive all the time and just be angry and reactive and everything is bad and everything is someone else's fault. That is the Reform playbook. That is the right-wing Conservative playbook. There are people in the Conservative Party and Labour as well who are very, thoughtful and do think about the underpinnings. I think the challenge for us is we've got to have those underpinnings and then employ the EQ to the max and then do the good sell and realise that it is about three simple messages that you can boil down into a slogan, and all of that matters. Can't lose sight of that. It is more transactional than it used to be. Okay. I think on social media, your point, Chris, about social media, both matter. And the other thing I would point out is young people don't get letters anymore. One of the most effective ways of communicating with a young person is often to send them a letter because it's such a novelty.
But I still think from my opening remarks that there is a massive desire deep in people's hearts for good. And it's how do you tap into converting that into voting for a party that's good and doesn't want to make you hate everyone.
Okay, that's fair enough. And ultimately, what we're trying to find here is how do we get at that good? I mean, if you look at primary school children, they are capable of the most wonderful generosity and the most horrible anger towards people that have riled them. So I suppose this is just human nature. We're trying to tap into the good stuff through the political system. We've got a couple of minutes left. I will have to have separate podcast discussions on Poland and the difference between North Oxford and West Oxford. But final thoughts from all three of you. What can we leave people watching and listening to this podcast with? We talked about redistribution, we talked about clear messages, we've talked about emotional intelligence, we've talked about a need for new economics. Anything else that we can throw in that gives people reason to believe in there can be something optimistic and hopeful that comes out of politics?
I'll go, and it's a very practical thing. But I've just come away from a weekend where I've spent 3 full days with my parliamentary colleagues, all 72 of us together and some of their staff. And this is the highest number of Lib Dem MPs we've had, certainly in my lifetime. And it's 40% women, 60% men. It's got a really broad range of ages. It's not just sort of one baby and then everyone else is older. Actually, it's really interesting. And they are thoughtful, good communicators who genuinely are good people who want to make the world a better place. And I have I know this is just about a numbers game, but actually it's one thing having, 72 MPs and actually, some of them you could take or leave. Actually, genuinely, every single one of the 72 now have a vigor and verve about them. And I believe that we are going to be a very mighty party in British politics now and punch well above our weight, as we often did, but especially now. The question then we have to answer is, what exactly are we going to use that power for? The open question is, do we understand our own power in this context? And what are we going to use it for? I'm not sure that's totally clear just yet, but the bare bones of our structures, certainly in Parliament, are something to be incredibly optimistic about.
Thank you. Timothy or Lynne?
Sorry,
Lynne,
I mean, I still believe that we can talk about balance. I think people are sick of lies and bad people. And I mean, I think in a way, one of the reasons when Ed showed his film about his home life, that touched the emotions of a nature, it was because it was leading to the good and the fine and the noble. And I think there is a great desire for that underneath a desire to also earn enough to eat.
Timothy?
Well, first of all, Layla, is one of your constituents and possibly even voters, I can tell you North Oxford is throbbing with subdued passion, as well as reason, of course. But one of those passions which is very widely shared is the passion for freedom. Freedom is not just an idea, it's also a feeling, an emotion. And Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is giving the Orwell lecture next week, and her title is The Feeling of Freedom. I've seen this again and again in unfree countries. And so I think one of the really good things that Kamala Harris did was reconnect liberalism to liberty, to freedom, and picking up this yearning for freedom in different areas of policy. We're speaking on the day, I think, Layla, you're just going into the debate on assisted dying. And for me, that is a debate about freedom, the freedom to choose as an older person, how I die. And so I think if we're talking about speaking to passion, to emotion, connecting in these different areas to that fundamental yearning for freedom is going to be a great thing for liberals.
Well, that's a very good note to end it on, given how central freedom is to the liberal canon. Time has also beaten us. My thanks to Layla Moran MP, Baroness Lynne Featherstone and Professor Timothy Garton. Really interesting thoughts coming out of that discussion. If you've enjoyed listening to it, please let your friends, family and other associates know how to access this podcast so as many people can listen to it as possible. And please keep up with the green-book.org.uk website for news on other podcasts and developments in general from the Green Book Group. From me, Chris Bowers, thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.